Good day, Black Knight scholars. Mr. Deegan here once again for Unit 9, Lesson 5. We're going to be talking today about India, Africa, and the Middle East. Do y'all smell that? That is the smell of the very last VidNotes video of the year. You have reached the last. Congratulations. Today we'll be talking about Africa and Nelson Mandela, India and Mohandas Gandhi, and how the Middle East modernizes and becomes independent. Some guiding questions for today. How did India and African nations become independent? And secondly, how was the modern Middle East created? British policies and India's demand for self-rule led to the rise of the India independence movement. A reminder, India was a colony owned by Britain from 1612 to 1947. In other words, for about 330 years, Britain owned not only India, but all of these neighbors of India, Pakistan to the west, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka to the east. The Republic of India, a democratic nation, developed when the country gained independence in 1947. And here is the Indian flag as it stands today. What was the partition of India after 1947? It was a religious conflict that led to fighting between Pakistan in green, here West Pakistan and East Pakistan, and Pakistanis were Muslims, versus other Indians who were largely Hindus. And this conflict led to Pakistan becoming a separate country. Today, India is the largest democratic country in the world with about 1.2 billion citizens. Here's New Delhi, a very large city in India. Today, 80% of Indians practice Hinduism, 14% worship Islam, and 2% Christianity. And here is another example of how India has become a very crowded place, especially its largest cities. Also, India has 29 states with more than 20 regional languages spoken. And here you see a map that shows all of the different states numbered from 1 to 29. India's diversity makes it challenging to run and organize a democracy with so many different religions and languages and ideas. But it still is a democracy. How did India become free in the first place? The Indian National Congress was a group that helped independence happen. It was founded in 1885. The Indian National Congress fought to end British rule and to have free elections. The Indian National Congress was 15 million members strong in the early 1900s. And here is a photograph of the very first meeting of the Indian National Congress way back in 1885. India became free because of good leaders. Here is Jawaharlal Nehru next to his friend Mohandas Gandhi. They were both important leaders of the Indian National Congress. Let's talk more about Mohandas Gandhi. Here he is. And he believed in two nonviolent forms of protest: civil disobedience, the refusal to obey a law intentionally to prove a point, and passive resistance, protesting a law publicly. And Gandhi was famous for his many protests, his hunger strikes, and this, Gandhi's Salt March. It was a 24-day march in India in March 1930, and it was a protest against how Britain was taxing Indians for its use of salt. And this event was publicized worldwide, and many around the world became sympathetic to Indians' fight for independence. And here you see Gandhi picking up a grain of salt at the very end of his march. Martin Luther King visits India in 1959. He was very public about his admiration for Mohandas Gandhi. This is what he says: "Since being in India, I am more convinced than ever before that the method of nonviolent resistance is the most potent, meaning powerful, weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for justice and human dignity." So Mohandas Gandhi influences the American civil rights movement in the 1960s, and its most important leader, Mr. King. Jawaharlal Nehru. Who is this man? He was important because of his accomplishments. He became the first prime minister of an independent India. He helped write India's 1950 constitution that wanted to prohibit, to ban, the caste system discrimination that was in India. If you were in the upper castes, you were considered royalty and better in society. If you were part of the lower castes of India's society, then you were considered the untouchables. You were somehow tainted. Well, Nehru wanted to get rid of that. Nehru also supported Western-style industrialization. He wanted to bring factories to India to create more jobs. And today, thanks in part to this man, Nehru, India is the 7th wealthiest country in the world, according to GDP measurements. We can't forget India's Iron Lady, Indira Gandhi. She was in power in India from 1966 until 1984. What did she accomplish? First, she was Nehru's daughter. She was the first female prime minister of India. And she formed a closer relationship between the Soviet Union and India during the Cold War. And she was responsible for creating India's nuclear weapons program, which made India a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. Now, on to modern Africa. Here is the continent, and we're going to be talking about Africa from 1945 until today. Why did independence movements erupt in Africa after World War II? Some background on this, and it has to do with the United Nations. The United Nations, and let's remember it was formed in 1945, guaranteed that all colonies throughout the world the right to self-determination. In other words, the right to chart their own future. As a result of this, independence movements in Africa challenged European imperialism in the years that followed. And European countries soon had to give up their African colonies. So why did these independence movements erupt? Pride in African cultures and heritage started to grow. Resentment, anger of imperial rule started, and there was a recognition of economic exploitation by the Europeans. They were taking advantage of African countries. Britain, France, Belgium, and Portugal all lost their colonies in Africa during this time. Let's remember back to the 1800s when white European rulers were dividing up Africa because they wanted to get rich. This was no longer the case after World War II. Let's talk about some specific African countries. Here's the continent, and let's start in the north with Algeria. Here's its flag, and Algeria's slogan for independence was "Peace does not include a vendetta. There will be neither winners nor losers." Algeria is the largest country in Africa, and it was owned by France. It was France's primary colony. About 9 million Muslim Arabs live there and 1 million French. In 1954, the Algerian National Liberation Front comes in, and they announced that they would fight for their freedom. So a bloody war follows between those Algerians and France. And France starts to realize that it could not be held by force. The French troops leave, and Algeria in July 1962 becomes independent. From Algeria, let's travel south to the Western African country of Ghana. Here is Ghana's flag, and its slogan was self-government now. And Ghana was led by Kwame Nkrumah. Here he is. He fought for independence non-violently, and he wanted positive action through strikes and protests and boycotts. In 1957, Ghana becomes the first sub-Saharan, that is, country below the Sahara Desert, to gain independence. On we go. Let's go further east and talk about this country, Kenya, in Africa. Kenya's slogan was, "Where there has been racial hatred, it must be ended. Where there has been tribal animosity, it will be finished. Let us not dwell upon the bitterness of the past." In Kenya, it was owned by Britain, and British settlers took the best farmland there, of course, to get rich. This man, Jomo Kenyatta, worked non-violently for independence in Kenya. But then that all changed with the Mau Mau Rebellion, when Kenyans started to burn the farms of the British, and violence started to happen. In 1963, Kenyans eventually win their independence from Britain, and after Jomo Kenyatta is taken out of prison, he becomes the first president of an independent Kenya. Let's travel from Kenya south all the way to the country of South Africa. And here is the South African flag. The cry for freedom in South Africa was, "Free Mandela, end apartheid." What is apartheid? Well, it's a word that means legal separation of the races in South Africa. In America, we had the Jim Crow laws. In South Africa, they had apartheid. If you were black, you had a separate bathroom, you had a separate beach, you had a separate part of a bus or train. Nelson Mandela protested apartheid, and as a result of some of his ideas, he spent 27 years in prison. Once he was released, was he bitter? No. In fact, he negotiated with the white leaders in South Africa to end apartheid. And once South Africa ends apartheid, he becomes the first elected black president in South Africa's first full election, in which blacks and whites could both vote. So Nelson Mandela is the MVP of South Africa, and I would argue the MVP of modern Africa because of how much he stood up to power. Let's now head to the modern Middle East and talk from 1945 until today. Here's the Middle East in gray. And some background. The mandate system, established after World War I by the League of Nations, does this look familiar? Was phased out after World War II. And with the end of the mandate system, new independent countries were created in the Middle East. In dark orange, you have Syria and Lebanon. They used to be owned by France, now they're free. In light orange, you have Jordan and Palestine. They were owned by Britain, they become free. Let's talk about Israel. Israel was a state created for Jews. It's important to point out the vocabulary word Zionism, which is Jewish nationalism that supports a Jewish nation in the land of Israel. And the United Nations votes to create Israel in the country of Palestine. So here is the chunk of land that is Israel today, and in green you have Palestine. So in May 1948, Palestine becomes Israel. And this decision by the United Nations has led to regional conflicts that continue today. Palestine was basically told, you must give up your land. And for some Palestinians, this felt like stealing to them. And here is an important Israeli leader. Her name is Golda Meir. She's the Iron Lady of Israel. One historian called her the strong-willed, straight-talking, gray-bunned grandmother of the Jewish people. And she is most known for her victory in the Yom Kippur War. During the holiest day in all of the religion known as Judaism, she defeated a Muslim force. This was the fourth time the Arab-Israeli War had broken out. And she could no longer depend on Europe for support, so she turned to the United States, who allied with Israel in this Yom Kippur War. From Israel, let's travel west to talk about Egypt. Here it is. Egypt, modern Egypt, was shaped by this man, Gamal Abdul Nasser. In 1952, Nasser led a revolution against the Egyptian king and against the Imperial British, who had owned Egypt and had been there since 1882. So, under Nasser, Egypt takes control of the Suez Canal, which is located within Egypt. And it had been controlled by Europe since 1875. When you control the Suez Canal, you make a lot of money. And Nasser also modernized and industrialized Egypt. Like Nehru did for India, Nasser does for Egypt. And Nasser establishes ties with the Soviet Union and becomes a world stage player. He also builds the Aswan Dam, which is a dam that is on the Nile River. There it is. And control of it was called the Miracle of the Nile. Ladies and gentlemen, we have one more set of summary questions before you are done with VidNotes for the year. Let's end this year with a 30 out of 30. And then the end. That's all I have for this year. This is VidNotes out. Mr. Deegan signing off for good.